Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I think that we have a rather busy morning, so I would like to introduce immediately John Casti. John Casti was born in Portland, Oregon in 1943, following completion of a doctorate in mathematics from the University of Southern California in 1970, as well as tours of duty in the Rand Corporation and the University of Arizona. He left the United States in 1974 to take up a post as one of the first research staff members of the International Institute for Applied System Analysis, IASA. This is in Wien, Austria. With the exception of a small break in the late 70s and early 80s to serve on the faculties of New York University and Princeton, Casti worked at IASA on problems of system modeling and applied system analysis until the autumn of 1986. At that time, he left to join the faculties of the Technical University of Wien as a professor in the Institute for Econometrics, Operation Research and System Theory. In 1992, Casti joined the Santa Fe Institute in Santa Fe, New Mexico, as a resident researcher and was named to the Institute's faculty in 1993. I invite John Casti to come here and make his presentation. Thank you very much. I leave the floor to John Casti.
Okay. Thank you very much for that introduction. I need to bring it slightly up to date, just for the sake of completeness. I am now returned from Santa Fe back to Vienna and back to IASA. So despite the fact that I made several very good faith efforts to escape from Vienna, it never works. And so now I'm not trying anymore. And also, I want to put in a small advertisement for a professional society of fellows called the Kinos Circle that I founded in Vienna 2 years ago. And it's not a society that you join, but it's one that only consists of fellows who are appointed by the other fellows. And our mission at the Kinos Circle is, to state it rather grandly, exploration of the future. To try to understand a little bit better, using tools of complexity science, using tools of futurology, what it is that's more likely to happen than not over the next several years or decades. So with that as a small preamble, I'm going to try and get my program up here. Yeah. Ah, there we are. Okay. That's it. Good. Yeah. Yeah, good. Perfect. Oops. Okay. Small preview. Now, when Roberto asked me to come here and speak in a session called Complexity and Management, I was actually rather happy for several reasons to receive that invitation. First of all, it's always a pleasure to come to Italy for any reason, and especially to see friends. But also this theme, complexity and management, it appealed to me very much because in one of my many incarnations, I've founded a couple of companies in Santa Fe, one in London, and right now I'm in the process of starting another one in New Zealand. And they all, in one form or another, deal with complexity, but complexity in the cause of solving problems, real problems, and in the cause of having some fun and at the same time making some money. So management is an important component of that process, and this theme, complexity and management, it's so unbelievably broad that it can mean almost anything. So I have to start by telling you what it is that it means to me in the context of this presentation today, and especially the management aspect. Management, of course, could mean managing people, managing money, managing materials, managing almost anything, and at different levels. And so at the crudest level, I would say you have what I would call tactical management, which is the kind of management that, roughly speaking, goes on within a given organization, within a single organization, managing the business and the people and the resources of that organization. That's not the kind of management that I want to talk about today. I would rather address the more strategic issue of the management of a firm, an institution, an organization, which is part of an entire industry. So this is more targeted toward the management of, let's say, a CEO or a board of an organization, to say, how do we run our company so that we can be competitive or even a leader within a whole cluster of companies within a given industry. So that's going to be the focus of this talk. Now, before I actually get to that specific issue, let me just talk briefly about the notions of complexity, the other half of the theme. And this little diagram I prepared to somehow give some vague indication of what I think of as the distinction between something being complex and something just being complicated. Complicated versus complex. And I don't want to belabor this diagram other than to point out to you that in the center of this diagram, in purple, is the phrase emergent behavior. Emergent behavior. Now, to my eye, the single most distinguishing characteristic of a complex system is that it displays emergent properties, emergent behaviors. Now, what that means is, first of all, you have a collection of objects that are somehow in interaction. They might be drivers in a road traffic system, or traders in a financial market, or animals in an ecosystem. And the fact that they're in interaction is what makes it a system, and not a collection of just isolated elements. And those interactions create, I'll say, global system properties that cannot be seen by looking at any of the individual elements. Okay. So, for example, think about a price change in a financial market. Now, that change of a price, a stock, let's say, it's the collective result of the decisions made by all the individual traders to buy or to sell or to do nothing. And if you look at any individual trader, you don't see a change of price. You just see a decision to do something. And similarly, in a road traffic congestion, that's a global property. It's an emergent property of a collection of drivers doing different things individually that lead to something that is not part of any individual driver. So this is the idea of an emergent behavior. And we'll see a bit more of that in the rest of this talk. Now, here's an example of a situation that some of you may remember. It's about 10 years ago now, a currency crisis in Mexico. And here I've put in some of the major pieces of that entire crisis, with various lines indicating the flow of decisions, the flow of information that percolated from the Mexican peso devaluation of the time through to something down here in the lower right corner, which I label your business in Argentina. So how does something going on in a ministry or in a finance house in Mexico City or in New York or in London how does it make its way to impact you in Buenos Aires? And the reason I put this diagram here is to suggest that you consider, the question, do you think of this picture as a picture of a situation that's just complicated, or is it complex? Now, I'm not going to answer that question. I have my own personal opinion, but it doesn't matter about my opinion. What matters is, what do you think? Is it complicated? Is this just a complicated system, or is it a complex system? And is this change or impact of your business in Argentina, is that an emergent property that comes out of some kind of interaction of these different elements, or not? Okay, so I just leave it open. Now, complex adaptive systems. I'll be not very bold when I make the statement to say that when you deal with the systems of everyday life, doesn't matter whether it's an ecosystem, a business, the human brain, a football game, or whatever, you're dealing with a complex adaptive system. Fundamentally, the only place where you find simple systems are in textbooks. So as soon as you leave the academia and go to the real world, you're dealing with a complex system. And here's a handful of examples. They just happen to be ones that I myself at one time or another have had some dealings with. And I need to update this overhead a little bit because it could be extended a bit. But I'm sure that every one of you, if you put your mind to it for about 15 seconds, could make your own list like this. It wouldn't be the same as my list, but you would have a list equally long of systems that you have studied, that you've interacted with, that you know something about, that we would categorize as complex systems. Now, what I want to show you now is my favorite example of a complex adaptive system. And in this football-mad country of Italy, this is, I think, well, it doesn't have to be Italy, almost every country. This is an example that everyone is familiar with, a football game. You might not like football, but you can't escape it. And this happens to be American football, but no matter. This principle is still the same. And what makes this a complex adaptive system? Well, first of all, you have a collection of objects, the players, and each of those objects has certain kinds of rules that they use in order to decide what to do at any given moment in the game. And so they follow their rule, they take an action, the players, they all interact in some way, and something happens. There's the ball is moved from where it is to somewhere else, and in fact there are also emergent properties that take place, like points scored. Points scored in a football game is an emergent property. It's something that comes out of the interaction of all of the objects. You can't look at any given player and see points. You can only see points when you put players into interaction. Furthermore, an important feature, that there's no player on that field who knows what everybody else is doing. So they have what I call local information. And somebody once said to me, they said, well, that's not true in international soccer. I'll call it soccer, not football. Because the goalkeeper can see what everybody else is doing. And I thought for a moment, oh, this is bad for me because it's a counterexample to my theory of local information. But in fact, it's only a pseudo counterexample because in fact, the only time the goalkeeper can see what everyone else is doing is when everyone else is at the other end of the field. And so the goalkeeper's information is useless. And as soon as the action moves to that goalkeeper's part of the field, all of a sudden the goalkeeper cannot see what everyone else is doing. So the principle still holds, thank goodness. Now, what are the basic principles? I call them fingerprints of complexity. Fingerprints of complexity. And there are 3 of them. I won't argue that you couldn't add a 4th one or subtract one of these, but these are the ones that I like. The first one is that there are a medium-sized number of objects or agents that make up the system. In a football game, it's, American football, it's 22, 11 on each side. But a medium-sized number, that's a kind of vague term, and what does it really mean? Well, it means that the number of objects, or we call them agents, actually, in system theory jargon. In fact, it can be dangerous jargon. I wanted to mention that a few years ago, I gave a talk on complex system theory in the headquarters of the CIA in Washington, D.C. And as soon as I started talking about agents, the ears perked up, and the people, see, in that audience, they had a different idea of what constituted an agent than what we were thinking about in Santa Fe. So, but this is the terminology in the system theory business. The agents are the objects that make up the system. And a medium-sized number, it means that it's not so small that you can work out all the interactions on a little back-of-the-envelope calculation. And it's not so big that you can use statistical aggregation to tell you anything that you really want to know about how the system works and behaves. So what's a medium-sized number can vary from one situation to another. In football, it happens to be 22. That's big enough. In classical physics, to give you an example at the other end of the scale, if you fill up a bottle with gas, there's about 10 to the 23rd molecules inside that bottle. Now, in fact, in order to answer the most important questions about what that gas is doing, you do not have to keep track of what each one of those 10 to the 23rd molecules is doing. You can statistically aggregate them into higher level quantities that we call pressure, temperature, and there's a rule that relates those higher level quantities, the ideal gas law. And you don't need to go down to the micro level to answer many important questions about that gas. So I would say if you really want to put a bound on it, a medium-sized number is something bigger than 2, because we also know from physics, as soon as you go to 3 bodies, the problems become very difficult. So bigger than 2 and smaller than 10 to the 23rd. So that's a medium-sized number, and I think we can all agree that gives plenty of scope for maneuvering. But in general, it means a few dozen to a few 100,000. That's a medium-sized number. Now the second fingerprint, intelligent and adaptive. Here by intelligent, I should have put it in quotes, because I don't mean intelligent in the sense of cognition or problem-solving ability, but rather in a much weaker sense. Intelligence just means that the agents in the system, they use rules to decide what to do at any given moment. And usually they have a spectrum of different kinds of rules that they might use, and at any moment they're using one of those rules to process information to take an action, like a trading rule in a financial market. There are thousands of different rules that traders might use. At any moment, they use one of them and they decide to buy or sell or do nothing. And they're always monitoring. The agents are monitoring how well the rule is working. Is it helping them achieve whatever their goals are? To get from their home to their business, to make money, to survive. But they're always evaluating how effective the rule they're using is, and if they discover that the rule they're using is not working, or not working very well, they can change to a different rule. So this is the adaptive part, which means, roughly, that you have to also have a rule for changing rules, a kind of meta rule, if you like, a rule for changing rules. And that's roughly what adaptation is about. It's changing your rules. And it's exactly what you don't have in the natural sciences. Planets don't have rules for changing their rule of motion. They go around in inverse square law. That's the rule of gravitational motion. And it doesn't change every now and then to inverse cube law or something of this kind. So this adaptive aspect, first of all, having a spectrum of possible rules and rules for selecting, a selection principle for choosing one rule over another. This is a feature that's much more characteristic of systems in the social and behavioral domain, not in the natural sciences. This is why I make the claim, and I don't think it's a very bold one, that the social sciences are much, much more difficult and complicated and complex than the natural sciences, physics, chemistry, astronomy. These fields are easy compared to the human and the social and the biological domains. Okay, in fact, I had an argument a few years ago with a colleague of mine in Santa Fe, Murray Gell-Mann, who many of you may know or at least heard of. I was sharing an office with him for several months. And, of course, he's a physicist, a world-class physicist. And lots of physicists have the view that, well, biology is just a kind of special case of physics, where you get the initial conditions right. And you could, in principle, describe everything about biological systems using the so-called theory of everything in physics. And I said, well, I had to disagree with him because I said, I think that it's just the opposite, that physics is a special case of biology. And he said, well, what do you mean by that? And I said, well, physics is the case, the degenerate case where the objects only have one rule. They never change their rule. And I think you could make a good argument on either side, but the point is that living systems change their rules all the time. And they don't just change their rules, they invent completely new rules that never existed before. This is the essence of innovation and creativity, is to generate new rules for doing things. And this is what, going back to the football example, this is what separates the great football players from just, the mediocre or the average ones. The great ones are able to, in effect, create completely new rules, new ways of playing their position that the average players don't do. And why don't they do it? Because they don't have the physical and mental ability to do it. So if you have the talent, you can, within the rules of the game, you can create new ways of playing your position which give you a differential advantage. So this I would call innovation, kind of innovation. Finally, the last fingerprint, local information. I touched on this a moment ago. It just means that there is no object in the system, there's no agent who knows what everyone else is doing. So each agent has to decide what rule to use and how to implement their rule on the basis of limited or partial information. So these are my fingerprints of complexity, and I would say if whatever system you happen to be studying, if you see these properties, you can feel confident you're dealing with a complex adaptive system. And I would go farther and say virtually every system of real life displays these qualities, and therefore it's inescapable to have to come to terms with complexity in real systems. Okay, so much for propaganda. Now let me give you a couple of pictures here about management and the tools of complexity science for understanding management of organizations. Now, the tool that I personally prefer is, in today's language, it's called agent-based modeling or simulation. And you might say, well, gee, John, you know, you're trained as a mathematician, you have all these degrees in mathematics, why don't you believe in mathematics as the way, just like physicists do? Why don't you believe in mathematics as a way of understanding complex systems? And I have several answers to that. Fortunately, they're all consistent with each other. But the most compelling answer is that there does not exist a decent mathematical framework for even asking the right questions, let alone answering them. In terms of complex systems, we don't have any good mathematical apparatus for studying complex systems. A lot of people like to use, say, dynamical system theory, which is okay, except that it's an inheritance from classical physics. It doesn't have built into it any natural way of studying adaptation or having heterogeneous agents, objects that each have different ways of behaving. And so we're in the complex systems business, we're kind of in the same situation that physicists were in at the time of Galileo. We have now laboratories for doing controlled, repeatable experiments to test hypotheses, but the Newton of complex systems has not yet appeared to give us a decent mathematical apparatus for addressing the questions that we most care about. So this is why what I'm going to talk to you about the rest of this talk has to do not with mathematical theorems and the tools of mathematical analysis, but rather with what I like to think of as laboratories for doing experimental complex systems analysis. And the laboratory, of course, is not the laboratory of a physicist, which might be a particle accelerator or a plane for rolling balls down an inclined plane like Galileo had, or a biological laboratory where you have tools for cutting up frogs and looking at things under microscopes. And that's not the kind of laboratory I have in mind. I have an information laboratory in mind, the digital computer, sort of like this one that's standing here in front of me. And the reason that I'm so enthusiastic, if you like, about this mode of analysis is because if you go back to that list I showed you a moment ago of examples of complex adaptive systems, take a stock market. If you want to have a good theory of finance, now the scientific method, a scientific theory of finance, the scientific method really requires that you have to have a laboratory in which you can do controlled, repeatable experiments to test hypotheses. And in the real world of finance, you can't make the very experiments that the scientific method calls for. If you have some mad theory of finance, you can't go down to Wall Street and ask them to change the rules to test your theory. And even if you could, you could never repeat the experiment under seemingly identical circumstances. It's just practically not possible. And I would make that same argument for just about every other system of everyday life. You cannot do the experiments that are required to test hypotheses. So by way of compensation, technology comes to our rescue And we can now, and this is what, if the Santa Fe Institute will ever be remembered in the history of science for anything, I think that it will be remembered as an organization that somehow promoted and advertised and popularized the idea of using a computer as a laboratory for doing experiments. So the idea then is to take the system that you care about and build an electronic copy of it inside your computer. A world that you can control and where you can do repeatable, controlled experiments. And you do your experiments inside your computer, not in the outside world. And this little overhead gives, it's still in the propaganda category, it gives you some reasons why strategic business simulations are an effective tool for understanding the ways businesses function. Now, of all the overheads in this presentation, this one is the single most important one, and if you don't go away from this room with anything else, please pay attention to this overhead, because this is the overhead that separates the real world from the academic world. If you want to have a business that does complexity science for paying customers, so you want to do business for fun and for profit, this is the set of characteristics and conditions that you have to pay attention to that in academia, by and large, you don't. You have to make your tool realistic. The user has to be actually actively engaged and involved in the process. It has to be accessible to your client. They have to be able to understand it and understand how to use it. You have to be able to develop it within a reasonable amount of time. You can't afford the luxury of polishing it for, a decade. They need answers like yesterday, not next century, and so on. So these characteristics are very important if you actually are concerned about real problems for real customers, and especially they're important if you want to get repeat business from your clients. Because if you violate any of these, you're going to have trouble getting that customer back in the door. So file this away for reference. Now I want to just finish this talk by giving you an actual example. This happens to be one that involves the world's catastrophe insurance industry. These are the companies that insure you or your business against major natural disasters, hurricanes, earthquakes, floods, things of that kind. Okay. Now, this was a activity that I put together some years ago now. It arose out of a talk that I gave in Bermuda, and that talk was to a collection of people from the world's reinsurance industry. The reinsurers are the people, the companies that insure the insurance companies. So if you wanted to buy earthquake insurance for your house in Reggio, you would go to some local company like Generali, for instance, and they would give you some insurance. Now, if so a company like Generali, they are a primary insurer, not a reinsurer. But if Generali discovers that all of a sudden they've written way too many policies, they have too much risk for earthquakes in Reggio, and they'd like to get rid of some of that risk, that's what the reinsurers are there for. The reinsurers are there to take that risk, some of the risk, for a price. So they insure the insurers. Now, most of, or at least a large number of big reinsurance companies are located in Bermuda for tax reasons. And a few years ago, some of them got together and they saw how the complexity science world was making its inroads into the world of finance. All these people going down to Wall Street to work for the brokerage houses instead of becoming physicists in academia. And so they thought, well, maybe the world of complexity science has something to say to our industry. And so they gathered together a handful of people and brought them to Bermuda to make some presentations. And there were actually 4 scientists there. I was one of them. And the others, it was extremely interesting for me because the others were all climatologists. There were 3 climatologists and me. So the first thing that this told me was these guys in the reinsurance business, what they thought was the single most important thing that science could contribute to their business was understanding hurricanes. Where, when, how intense, and so on. And I have to admit to you, I didn't really understand the logic of this at all. And I certainly didn't have anything to tell them about hurricanes. But I felt that this, to my view, if I were running a big insurance company, this would not be the thing that I would be most concerned with, predicting hurricanes. In fact, I thought, suppose, it's kind of a thought experiment, suppose you had a 100% effective, perfect method for predicting hurricanes. A guaranteed no-fail method. And the logic of it is pretty simple. That would be the worst possible thing that could happen to the insurance industry, because the whole essence of the insurance industry is based on risk. And as soon as you eliminate risk, then you eliminate the need for the insurance industry. So this would be a disaster to have a perfect method for predicting hurricanes. And of course you could say, well, what about the other end of the scale? Suppose I know nothing. I have no way of assessing the likelihood or unlikelihood of a hurricane in a particular place at a particular time. Now, that's equally bad, because then you have no rational way to decide how much to charge for your product. Again, it's random risk. Random risk versus no risk. These are both bad, disastrous for the insurance industry. And the logical conclusion that comes from this is there's some sweet spot, some optimal level of risk at which your industry is most healthy. Now we're getting to a question that's interesting. And the interesting question is, where is that sweet spot between 0 and 1? And the answer is nobody knows. And the second part of the answer is it's different for each company. It's not just in a particular spot for everybody who's in this industry. For some companies, that sweet spot is in a different place than for other companies. So when I made my presentation, my argument was what I've just told you. And to be honest with you, there were probably 300 or 400 people in the room, and I suspect that about 93.5% of them found this argument literally incomprehensible. Incomprehensible. But fortunately, not all of them. So afterwards, a bunch of people who actually understood the argument, we started talking about what it is that I suggested. My suggestion was, we can now build inside our computers in Santa Fe a high-fidelity, faithful copy, electronic copy of your industry. How all the various firms interact, the primary insurers, the reinsurers, and of course there's nature on the outside that plays kind of the role of a practical joker, because until nature steps in and gives you a hurricane or an earthquake or a flood, nothing happens except insurance companies receive money, but they don't pay anything out. So nature in this case is the random element in the picture. So anyway, we built this world. Here were some of the participants. These were I have formed a consortium of 8 companies. Here they are listed in capital letters. They're in caps, and the scientists are in lowercase letters because the insurance companies provided all the money. But they also provided expertise. Part of the deal was they would each point at least one person from their firm to be actively engaged with us as the modelers. And we agreed that we would do this for a year, and we met 5 times during that year in different parts of the world to review where we stood, the current version of this insurance world, and so forth. So I know that time is probably fleeting. So here are some of the questions that this insurance world intended to answer. The most important one on this list is the last one. Many more questions. Because what you discover when you build these worlds, like what you discover when you, in a lot of experiments in science, that you have an intention to do something, but you discover the tool is a lot more useful for something else after you have it. And so that's why I put that last one in there. Here's the structure of a toy version of this simulator. It only involved 5 firms and 5 reinsurers. Only 2 kinds of catastrophes, earthquakes and hurricanes. And the economy is reflected by interest. This is a vastly scaled down version of the real thing, but it gives you the general idea. And the companies are described by these various qualities, if you like, that are in these boxes. So each company has a different profile. They're not all created equal. In fact, they're very different. Swiss Re is a radically different company in every respect than, say, ACE. And that's reflected by the numbers that you fill in these boxes to represent these firms. And here's a little cartoon version of how the major pieces of this industry interact. And the idea of the way that the world works is you set up the profiles for the different companies, and the players, if you like, are effectively the upper management of each one of these firms. The decisions the management has to make about where should we try and develop our markets, what kind of prices we should charge for our products, what should we do with the revenues that come in, because insurance companies receive a lot of money, especially when nothing is happening, and they have to use that money in some way. Should we give some of it back as dividends? How should we invest it in real estate or equities? And how should we make sure that we have enough in our reserves that if nature throws in a Kobe earthquake, that we're able to pay off, that we can get our hands on that money quickly? So they can't afford the luxury of putting all their money into very long-term locking it up. They have to balance out ready access to cash versus better return on longer term investments. So there are a lot of different decisions that the management of each of these companies have to make, and what actually happens in the industry is an emergent property. You say, well, what's the best thing to do? If I'm running a company, say, what's the best thing I can do? And my answer for you is, well, there is no best thing for you to do. The best thing depends upon what everybody else is doing. And you don't know what everybody else is doing. You know what some of them are doing. And you can make some guesses about the others, but in fact, there is no such thing as the best thing to do. But a tool like this gives you some help in saying, well, if my competition is doing this, and nature is doing that, and the outside world, the Federal Reserve Bank is doing this, and so on, what's going to happen? Or what's likely to happen? Well, you can use this to do that experiment. So here's one of the thousands of kinds of outputs that can come from this world. This happens to be the primary insurers, and I gave them names here of real insurance companies, so I hope that there's nobody in the audience from any of those companies, because they're just names. It's not intended to reflect their actual behavior. But what's interesting in this picture, this is the equity in the firm over, and this world is designed to run over a 10-year period in time steps of 3 months. So they're 1 quarter per step. And here you see that 3 of those companies over that 10-year period basically ended up in the same place where they started. Not much happened. But one of them went out of business, and the other one, Zurich, soared off into the stratosphere. Now, you say, well, why did that happen? Well, if you go back, and this is what you can do in this world, you can go back and see what did happen. You'll see that there was a major earthquake in this 3rd year, and that company that went out of business was overexposed. It had too much risk and not enough capital to pay off. So they went out of business. Now, why did Zurich all of a sudden take off and the rest of them not? Because the customers in that region, when their insurer went out of business, Zurich picked up most of the business. And there were no more major events. Now, interestingly enough, I don't have a picture to show you, but if that earthquake had happened, say, in year 7 or 8, instead of year 3, this company would not have gone out of business, because by then they would have accumulated enough capital that they could have sustained that kind of a loss and still stayed alive. So timing is important. But the management of that company, they did not lay off enough risk to the reinsurers. That's the fundamental message. Okay, so here's the last picture. 3 minutes. Well, it will take 30 seconds because this is the last one. And this is just a kind of, again, to close with a little bit of a kind of, I'll call it advertising for this insurance world. But since I have 2 minutes left, I'll tell you that I recently finished up a project with colleagues in a very different area, agriculture, in the biggest research center in New Zealand, the Agricultural Research Center, because that's the biggest part of the economy of New Zealand. And it follows this same prescription, except it's not about insurance, it's about dairy farming. So you probably didn't realize that you were listening this morning to one of the world's great experts on New Zealand cows. But the same idea applies. You have a whole industry. You have producers, the farmers who actually produce the milk. You have processors like Parmalat, who actually process this into cream, milk, yogurt, all the kinds of things that you want. And you have the consumers, the supermarkets or even individuals who buy this stuff. And then there are several other components to this kind of a world. You have the land developers, you have the government regulators, you have climate now in today's world, the issues of climate change and how it impacts these businesses. So you have all these various modules, and this world, which is called, not very imaginatively, dairy world, is now in place in New Zealand, and it will soon be in place in a lot of other parts of the world because there is no such product anywhere else. But what's interesting about it is not so much as the dairy world, but if you take those boxes, the producer, the processors, the consumers, and so on, and you relabel them, and don't call them farmers and dairy processors and so on, but think about the oil industry, it's the same picture. The picture doesn't change. The basic logic is exactly the same. You have producers, you have refiners, you have consumers, you have regulators, and so on. So when you build the abstract structure of one of these worlds, it doesn't change much. The details, of course, change a lot depending on the specific part of the real world you're trying to address, but the central core, or the nucleus, if you like, of the worlds remain invariant. So once you build one, it's a lot easier to build the next one. It's like writing a book. The first one's always difficult because you don't know what to do. But after you've written, 5 or 10 books, then it gets easier. So same thing with agent-based models. It gets easier as it goes along, but it gets more interesting too. So, okay, I think this is a good time to stop. And shall we have questions or discussion? Okay, thank you. Are there any comments? Yes, please.
Have you done any work to try and look at this in a more global perspective, where you would take into account things like, we know, for example, that Islamic banking is different. There is a kind of a paradigm they call Islamic banking, ethical banking. There are cultural differences. In Italy, we have a culture which is more coloured by Roman Catholicism than in the more Protestant countries. Is that just do cultural process or cultural norms and what they call preferential rules of culture affect these kind of things, or are they kind of outside the scope of your modeling system?
Well, first of all, they're certainly not outside the scope. Even on that list that I put up there, there were 2 European, Swiss Re and Zurich. They were Swiss companies, but in terms of whether the cultural aspects matter or not, it depends on the questions, whether it matters or not. But if they do matter, and there's no theoretical way of knowing, you basically have to somehow do the experiment and see what matters and what doesn't. But if they do matter, then they get reflected in 2 ways. First of all, in the choice of rules that the objects have for deciding what to do or what not to do, and perhaps also in the background environment, let's say the backcloth against which these events unfold. And so certainly the farmers in New Zealand, for example, they do not use the same rules as the dairy farmers in the alpine areas of Austria and Switzerland. So they're still farmers, they're still producing the product, but they do it in a different way because I don't think in that case it might be some cultural, but also they have different kinds of cows actually. So yes, those kinds of things, they're rather easy to accommodate, but they do matter.
Yeah, they should be because, no, I think in terms of things like corporate culture, consumer behavior, which varies quite a lot. I mean, Bangladesh is very different from Norway, for example. Right?
Yeah.
So that
it matters.
But of course, I mean, here you have this this idea. You're doing complexity modeling, or you're talking about something which is complicated, because it's highly complicated if you're going to start to take into account issues, very kind of on the ground issues like cultural mores, norms, and things like that. So, but it would be interesting to actually think about cultural semiotics. They have theories about cultural codes.
I agree with you. I think that this is where the details inside, the box labeled producer or processor or whatever, abstractly at that level, it all looks the same. But as soon as you open up the box and look in, then the details start mattering.
Okay, first of all, thank you for your anecdote on the CIA and agents. This reminded me when I was teaching at a course for people in public administration, and I was explaining one of these agent-based models, which was built on a cellular automaton. So I was thinking of agents in the cell. And then in the end, we were speaking about the different languages which we were using. And the lady raised her hand and she said, well, I used to be the director of a prison. And so thinking of agents in a cell meant an entirely different thing to me. So it's a nice anecdote. Well, in your beautiful talk, you raised many issues. I want to just ask one question, which I think is the most relevant for this audience. So I'm not going to discuss what's complex, what's complicated, and the like.
Good.
But rather, the thing which you presented, in a sense, and all the agent-based modeling business, has many similarities with the inspiration of system dynamics, good old system dynamics, which was proposed by J. Forrester and is still there in some way. Even the idea of using the computer as a laboratory was already there. But in the end, system dynamics didn't take off. So my question is, what are the reasons why now with this different approach, with say, much deeper theoretical insight which comes from complexity science, can we be more optimistic now on this use of agent-based models with respect to what was proposed already in the 60s?
Okay, well, my short answer to that is that the distinction that I would draw between Forrester-Meadows style system dynamics, limits to growth kind of thing back in the 70s, and agent-based models is the difference between top-down versus bottom-up. In the system dynamic world, if you go back and look at that literature, you'll see that the quantities that were the essential aspects of their models were highly aggregated quantities. They were things like population, gross domestic product, things of that kind. Agent-based model, and that was fine because in those days we didn't have the kind of cheap, readily available, high-quality computing power that we have today. I mean, that was, after all, 30, 40 years ago. But now you can go down to the micro level, and it would be as if you wanted to study a gas in a bottle, and you didn't know about pressure, temperature, and so on, but you could keep track of what each individual molecule was doing, and you could calculate its momentum and its the pressure it exerted against the side of the bottle, and so on. And what will happen if you do that is you will discover the ideal gas law. You won't need Boltzmann statistics to do it. You will discover it empirically because you can keep track of what each individual element is doing. Forrester and Meadows were not able to do that. And this is why I think, I don't want to claim agent-based models is kind of a universal procedure that will solve every kind of question and every kind of situation. You have to, like in any other model, you have to put information in if you want to get information back out. One of the things I always have to tell clients when I'm doing consulting, practically the first thing I tell them is don't expect too much from mathematics and computing. Mathematics plus computing does not equal magic. Okay? I think that there will be limitations, and just as there were in system dynamics, but it will be interesting to see where those limitations come from and whether they're insurmountable.
Any other question? No.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your presentation.